That family that you have at the holiday is a lot like this family. Because most of the stuff that you read in the media about media and communications company is just a fragment of what's really going on. And so there's actually two things that happen at once. One is there's an embedded story, which you don't read about in the papers. And the other is that people who drive this stuff are riding a really long-term communications and cultural cycle, frankly, that they're aware of that doesn't get talked about a lot. And so I wanted to share this theory with you. And I think for those of you that get into it, it will really help you harness the power of innovation and creativity and target it to specific times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the past, then I'm going to go into the present, then I'm going to go into the future. And I'm going to wind up ending with social. So in the past, media was really, and communications were defined by scarcity. There wasn't a lot you could do. You could get stuff from the church or you could get it from a local performance, but everything was about oral tradition, right? There was no definitive history or way to access anything. This starts to change around the time of the end of the Industrial Revolution, and one of the first people to really harness it is Dickens, who senses that there's an opportunity here. And the opportunity that he sees is the fact that suddenly there's this means of production and distribution that has never existed before, and that's the mainstream printing press. And so Dickens is one of the first people who decides that there's probably a way to harness that and create what turns out to be called spreadable media in the future. And he creates a lot of amazing things, both from a business and a creative perspective. He creates the idea of cliffhangers. He creates serialization, which will later drive many aspects of the TV and movie business. He also buys printing presses and drives distributors and publishers, in some cases, out of business so that he can control his own message. So he can control the supply of his own product in order to generate demand. And he does it masterfully and becomes one of the first international media celebrities. And in his wake over the next decades, he sort of gives rise to the beginning of discrete business models for this stuff, right? So there's a single purchase book, and there's a magazine which is a subscription model, and there are advertising-driven business models as well for print. Very quickly, almost the inverse thing happens in film. Thomas Edison, who's obviously a brilliant guy, has a real passion for movies, but he actually gets the whole thing wrong. He really believes that the notion of motion pictures is going to be what we would call today a single-player experience. He bets on this thing called the kinetoscope, which is the idea that we watch movies in an individual experience. He also creates the Edison Patent Trust, who vigorously prosecute anybody who infringes on his patents. This sets up two things to happen. One is that clearly he's wrong, that film wants to be a communal business, but the folks who know that are these guys. A bunch of Eastern European immigrants who sense the latent power of motion picture and are not afraid of Edison in the slightest and actually go against him in court and win, but still, just to be on the safe side, decide to move out west and move to a suburb of Los Angeles called Hollywoodland, and that is honestly the beginning of the studio system. In music, it happens in a sort of a similar way. There are people for and against. Caruso embraces the idea of music technology as a way to syndicate his brand, while other people fight it and say that it's going to be the death of music, like John Philip Sousa. Over time, obviously, the ones who believe that it's good for them win. Television actually takes about 50 years to happen, and one of the really fascinating things is that for decades, people are talking about television to the point where it's like putting a man on the moon or sending somebody to Mars. A lot of people just don't believe it'll ever happen. What it has to wait for is for these business and cultural cycles to catch up, because television can't work just for some people. You can't have a television that works on CBS and doesn't work on NBC. You can't ship a Philco box and not have it work for everybody. So there's this massive buildup, and once it comes out, it quickly begins to dominate. The model that it has from a business perspective and a creative perspective is broad, right? It's the opposite of everything that Gregory is describing. It's designed to reach as many people as possible. It's not about subtlety, and it's advertising driven. So television comes out, and what quickly happens through the middle of the 20th century, now that these models exist, is that folks begin to figure out how they're going to work together. If you're a writer and I'm a manager and Nolan's a publisher, we begin to map out how we're going to work together from a business and production standpoint, such that Nolan and I don't step on each other's toes and we all get paid. And what that leads to is a situation where suddenly all of these models around media in each group, in production and creative, get mapped out, and the folks who are good at it drive the others out of business and buy each other up. So what that leads to at the end of the 20th century is a situation where 6 companies controlled the vast majority of global media. And that's essentially the story that most of us come in on. In the 21st century, there's this thing that even though everybody talks about it, I think is still widely underappreciated. And that's just how tremendously disruptive digital is. Because what happens is, all of these things in retrospect, all of these business models are based on one thing. And that's constrained supply, right? So think about it. If you wanted to buy a record in the 20th century, there were only so many that were coming out that month. If you wanted to go to a movie, there were only so many in the multiplex. If you wanted to go buy a book, there were only so many on the shelf. Digital blows that away because all of a sudden people have choice. And so it's not just the moguls and the curators and the publishers that decide what people are going to consume. People are going to decide for themselves what they want to do. And what happens in rapid succession from that, once digital unshackles supply, is that in print, that in movies. And by the way, this is that critical period, 2001, 2002, where bandwidth gets good enough to really become disruptive. It hits them all at once. That's box office, and that's music. All within 18 months of each other, they're all decimated, largely. So that's the power of a technology wave to ride, right? Now, what would you have done if you had seen this coming? Well, surprisingly, there were some people who saw it coming, and as it turns out, a lot of them were in television. Because there were enough entrepreneurs in television to begin to think about how they could offer more supply and make a lot more money from it. So in the 80s already, television is shifting from this broadcast model to a cable model where you have wide choice, you can get a whole bunch more stuff, and you pay for it. Because people are willing to pay for choice well in advance of the time that studios think that they will. And so television moves into this model of narrowcasting, anticipating the internet. And so while the top shows and the top movies are going down in penetration, what TV is doing at the same time is increasing the number of choices every year. What that leads to is a situation where even when digital happens, television becomes the most powerful economic force in the history of world media. And as a data point around just how powerful it is, ESPN, as most of you know, is owned by Disney, right? ESPN is worth more than Walt Disney Pictures, Pixar, Touchstone, Marvel, the Disney parks, and everything else that Disney owns combined. That's how much money cable networks throw out. So when you think about the TV business and how vigorously some of them seem to fight to maintain the cable model, now you know why. It's tremendously lucrative, and it rides, while all these other businesses are sort of tumbling in the digital era, TV just gets stronger and stronger. Now, creatively, there's an interesting here. So if you're looking at this sort of progression or this cycle, rather than as a business person, as an artist, here's an example of what happens artistically. AMC, American Movie Classics, decides that they want to rebrand, and they're smart. So they're not going to rebrand in order to reach as many people as possible. Their goal is to become the no extra fee HBO. So that it's something that you get in your service already, but that people who are of a higher economic demographic are going to be willing to pay more for because they think it's really good. And so the goal is to do some really great stuff that commands a very highbrow audience and then to charge more for it. And so it's under that basis that Mad Men happens, which wouldn't be able to happen under normal circumstances, right? There's no way to do Mad Men in a broadcast era. It's never going to appeal to that broad an audience. The goal of AMC in doing that is to increase their license fee and to be able to do more and more shows that are going to be things that people will not do without. And indeed they do. They effectively triple their revenue. Amazing success story, but based largely on creative innovation. I want to go into this new era that we're headed into. First of all, the proliferation of online video is not just a technical change, although it's a technological change for sure. It's also a cultural shift, right? It's a generational shift. And those things are really hard to put back in the bottle. You can't stop them. No media top-down person, going back to Edison, right? If anybody should have been able to harness or drive the way that a medium was going to work, it was Edison. Generally speaking, that's really hard to do. So you've got different things. You've got a shift in the economy, you've got a flattening, you've got the increase of YouTube video, and then I want to talk about this macro trend that's going on. These are the top 10 videos on YouTube as of this week. So the number 10th video has about 600 million views. 600 million views is a lot. It's more than the 1-for-1 the population of North America. PewDiePie, who Ken mentioned, is now up to 5.3 billion views. So if he keeps on this trajectory, that's one view for everybody on the planet Earth. These are hard numbers to argue with. Meanwhile, back on the traditional side, in the old model, in the old part of the cycle, television has added, cable has added about 60 channels in the last 5 years. You can see for yourself how many more channels people watch. None. One of the interesting test cases, and you'll read about this in the paper and it won't make any sense till you put it in perspective, is this suit between Cablevision and Viacom. So Cablevision, which is a big distributor in New York, effectively says to Viacom, look, we don't want to pay you for 22 channels that nobody watches. We want to pay you for the 8 that they do watch. And this actually winds up going to court. It's still going on. But that's the sign that a model has the wheels coming off, right? Because when people are making money, they don't fight with their partners, right? When people start fighting with their partners, it's because there's threat to the model. So this eventually goes to court, and this sums it up pretty well. So this suit continues, and you see a series of these. You'll see more of these. Dish, to the point I made earlier about AMC tripling their license fee, Dish just drops AMC. They say, we can't afford this anymore. It's got to go. And they do it during the finale of Breaking Bad, which isn't the best possible time to do it. So there's a massive hue and cry, and it's a public relations nightmare. But this goes to show you the pressure. TV's really expensive. And so one of the things that we can't talk about too much, but everybody's familiar with the notion of multi-channel networks, these networks that do online content. Well, one of the questions that you can look at is, do multi-channel networks have to become more like cable networks? Or do cable networks have to become more like multi-channel networks? Because for cable networks that people don't want to pay for anymore, increasingly there's going to be pressure on this bundle to break. So that talks about the content creators in the traditional media space. Let's talk about the distributors. Well, this is the way that cable companies describe themselves and to the lobby groups in Washington, D.C. Look what's number one. Number one is broadband. Cable companies are in the broadband business. Cable companies are increasingly not so much in the TV business. Why? Because in America, 67% of the population can get broadband from only one of two places. If you're one of those two places, that's a pretty good business to be in, right? 100% of the American population can only get it from a maximum of 3 places. So if you talk about broadband being the driver of the 21st century economy, think about the stranglehold potentially of that. So I want to talk about this a little bit more. This is why DIRECTV, everybody saw that DIRECTV is being bought by AT&T? I just told you why. Because a television distributor that doesn't have broadband can't survive anymore. It's just too expensive. Content's too expensive, and the money is largely in broadband distribution. So the television business has already moved to broadband. Broadband becomes the facilitator of all media transactions. And so what I started to say before about that birth of television point, and prior to that, the point where Dickens comes in, is that it's in this business and cultural cycle, that thing that I called an unraveling, where all bets are off and new models get developed. Guess where we are now? We're in the next unraveling. This is a point where new models get built, where economies are in tough position, where individuality is prized, where people are less consensus driven, where you kind of have to be an entrepreneur and a nomad to succeed. But here's the good news. All of these companies were created in unravelings, or depressions or recessions. So it actually turns out that there is no better time to create a new company than times where there's low consensus. So if you look back historically, most of the changes that have been driven by entrepreneurs have not happened in highs. They've not happened in booms. They've happened when the bets were off. Look at the number of companies that were created during the Great Depression or various recessions, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So what things will work in this new unraveling? Well, the first one, and the strongest, is that clearly narrow beats broad. Businesses that look to reach everybody will fail. Your goal is to define the niche and the audience that you can command, because as we move further up this business cycle, there's going to be more and more scale. More and more people are going to come into the conversation. So if you can command an audience now, that audience will probably grow. If you try to speak to everybody, you're going to get washed out. Global beats domestic. We don't have time to look at global demographic trends in the world, but they're really favorable in a lot of places in the world. Here, you know, not so much, kind of middling. So if you can find an audience in this increasingly global digital village in New Zealand or in Bali or in Australia or in Indonesia or in Europe, speak to them. You won't have to get on a plane very often. You'll just have to find out who they are and speak to them digitally. This is a really interesting one, I think. So ARPU is one of the things that the cable business really got right. ARPU is a metric standing for average revenue per user. That's how the cable business has really effectively measured success. So in other words, it's not about your gross revenue. Gross revenue doesn't matter if you're losing money. What's important is how much money you're going to make per customer, because as you get more customers, that number is only going to get more favorable in theory. So you want to think about, as you get a new raging fan, which to Gregory's point is what this is all about, how much value can you extract from those people, and what does that turn out to look like in a model as things increasingly get better and better. And then lastly, obviously, data beats all. You don't want to start a new business and do a lot of hand waving. You do want to monitor your success and see what's working. Wayne Gretzky wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, he wasn't the tallest. He was asked why he was the best in hockey at the time. He said, I don't know. I think it's probably because I don't skate where the puck is. I skate where it's going to be. That's what you want to do. You want to skate to where the puck is going to be. Don't worry about the business that you're in today. Think about, do what these people did who were successful, and think about what the world that you're going to be in 5 years from now, or 10 years is going to be like. That's why these cycles are so helpful. William Goldman was one of the most successful screenwriters in Hollywood during the golden age. He was asked what the secret to his success was, and he said that. And it sounds like a joke, but it's actually pretty profound, right? Because if you know the knitting audience, there's nobody who may know it better than you. Certainly Zuckerberg doesn't. Certainly Bob Iger at Disney doesn't. So really, this is a time where all bets are off. There's just as much reason for you to believe that you can forecast the future as there is for anybody, any CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company who's got all sorts of pressure and supply constraints and all sorts of other things to deal with. This really is a time for innovators. And then lastly, in a time of increasing change, what's the best thing to do? Best thing to do is to be the change. Picasso was asked why he moved from his blue period and out of his blue period, and when he did Cubism and when he got out. And he said, you know, people keep using these old definitions as if it wasn't just the job of an artist, and I'd say a business person too, to create new ones. The cool thing about doing anything new or anything innovative is that it can't be recognized until it's done. So again, in closing, this is an incredible time to do something new and interesting, and if you do, I think you will be rewarded. And that's it for me. Thanks.